Without further ado, well, I was trying to without further ado, and then you do further.
That's more calming.
I like that you're making Emily proud. That's particularly good.
So proud that she's had to move to a different room.
Well, Dawn's the same. When I start presenting properly, it's all arms and legs, and it's safer to be somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm going to try and not do too much gesturing, but we shall see how deep we get into Echinoderms.
Yeah, well, I think that the good thing about Zoom is you can always just sort of pan up, and people just see fingers at the bottom. Yeah. And I think if you're happy, Will, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. It's been really great to learn from you and Dawn, and to take part in Seasearch and meet everybody. So really nice to be able to contribute a little bit. I'm speaking to you because I'm an evolutionary biologist working in Norwich, and I have some teaching responsibilities. So I teach a little bit at the University of East Anglia. And this is a section from one of my lectures I deliver to first year biology students on the kind of history of vertebrate evolution. And I've just taken out the Echinoderms bit and kind of fleshed out the bit that we're all really interested in, the bit focused on the biodiversity of the west coast of, no, not the west coast, that's the wrong side. Oh dear, confused already. The biology of the east coast, biodiversity of the east coast of the UK. So as an evolutionary biologist, my slides are not changing. I often begin to think about things on a timescale covering the whole history of the Earth. So thinking about things in really ancient history where the origin of species lies. This is a timescale of billions of years. And to think about echinoderms like this, we have to think about 500 million years ago. So this is a period we call the Cambrian Explosion. And as sea searchers, it's a period we should think about quite a lot, because it's a period where many of the invertebrate species that we look at when we're recording on the shores and under the seas of the east of the UK, where many of those species are first seen in the fossil record at around this time. And many of these worms, crustacea, gastropods and mollusks all share their evolutionary roots in this period of really great biological innovation about 500 million years ago. But we're not here to talk about all of these guys. We're focusing on echinoderms. And the reason I've kind of begun my introduction to echinoderms in this really deep history point is because it's where we see a really interesting part of their biology emerge as well. So if I show you this evolutionary tree, which describes the evolution of the species I've just shown pictures of, this is a timeline along the bottom of the figure, and the Cambrian period is highlighted in red. But the important divergence in this tree that is put over this timeline happens at this point. And this is a divergence of two major branches of the tree of life. So all of those species I mentioned are part of a large group of organisms we call protostomes. And the echinoderms are the first species we see in the fossil record that represent a totally different branch of the tree of life. And these are called deuterostomes, and they are really, really different. They have a different way of developing from the embryo through to the adult. And this has got some really important implications for how the organisms work. So why should I raise that, and why is it interesting to us as sea searchers? Well, echinoderms are part of a group we call Ambulacraria, and this group is much more closely related to a group called the Chordata than any other invertebrate we know of. And the chordates are the lineage we belong to. They split off from the invertebrates at this point here, around that point, about 500 million years ago. But chordates go on to evolve into other species you might record in the rock pools, such as the fish, and ultimately chordates are the recorders doing the Seasearch recording. Humans are chordates. We have a spine, we're vertebrate. And this makes the Ambulacraria really interesting to study for biology, because they're the closest thing to the vertebrates that aren't vertebrates. So they have very similar genetic makeup, but they haven't got the key genetic changes that make vertebrates have the biology that they do. So when we're doing studies that compare between different ways of biology, ways of DNA coding for biology, we need these close comparisons to learn more about vertebrate species and ultimately about the human. So the Echinoderm is a species, a group of species that we will encounter quite a lot on the East Coast, but they are very interesting to science for many reasons relating to their ancient history as well. So who are the Echinoderms? What do we mean when we say Echinodermata? So the name itself tells us a bit about the species we'll be talking about. It's a fusion of a Latin word and a Greek word. So echinos for spiny and dermata for skin. And with a name like that, we don't need to be surprised when we can think about a host of really spiky skinned and beautifully colored organisms. And these are brightly colored pictures of tropical species I use to snare students in enthusiasm for things they might not have thought about. But I'm going to move on to UK species later in the slides. So we know that Echinoderms represent starfish, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers, and also a range of other species I'll talk about. But one thing that is present across all of these species is that they have a thick spiny skin, and this is it's possible to see this. Oh, I'm getting loads of feedback all of a sudden. Yeah, so Echinoderms have thick spiny skin, and this is made of a proteinous layer that is surrounding endoskeletal plates made of calcium carbonate. And we see this across all of the species we'll talk about. And there's also a whole load of other characteristics that they exhibit. So many of the species exhibit radial symmetry, so they are you can see planes of symmetry that radiate around a central point. And for many species, the sort of vast majority of species, this is based or begins with a 5-pointed radial pattern, body pattern. But this is also not universal to all Echinoderms. And some of the species we'll talk about in our eastern waters don't have 5 arms. They can have many more, so it's not a universal character. And Echinoderms can also be defined by some of their internal characteristics, ones that we might not necessarily see when we're diving or looking in shore surveys. So internally, Echinoderms have a water vascular system, which I'll talk about in a minute. And part of this is also the tube feet, which is a unique structure to the Echinodermata. But they use those to move around the environment, and we see them to a greater or lesser extent in all of the species. And Echinoderms also have a unique way of breathing in the water, adaptations called dermal branchi, which I'll show you later on. And they also reproduce in with a characteristic form of larvae. So I'll have a look at those. So the first structure that we'll see in many of the species, some to more of an extent than others, are the tube feet. So these are the prime method that these organisms move around. They use them to draw their bodies across the substrate that they live on. And they are differently placed in different species within the Echinodermata. So some of them will be in these ambulacral grooves. So we can see on this upside down Sunstar that they are arrayed down the central grooves of the arms. So moving from the ends of the arms down to the mouth in the center. And this is how the arrangement is in the Asteroidea, the starfish and sunstars. But we can also see them in urchins, where they're much more evenly spread around the organism and much longer. So if we look at a cutaway diagram, using a starfish as an example in this case, we can see that the tube feet have a very defined internal physiology. So they have a bulbous sac at the top called the ampulla, and then a long appendage which extends from the organism called the podium, which is the bit that pulls the organism forward. The ampulla is controlled by muscles and allows really fine control of the hydrostatic force that allows the podium to be extended and to draw the organism through the environment. These tube feet, the ampullas, are connected to a radial canal. So these spread down each of the arms, or in species that don't have arms, they're arrayed around the edge of the body so that the tube feet can be connected to this vascular system, which is filled with water and maintained at different osmotic pressures in comparison to the seawater. And this whole system is controlled by a central canal right in the middle of the organism. So it rings around the digestive tract. And the water that fills it and allows this hydrostatic movement to happen is controlled by a really interesting calcified organ called the madreparae. And this is a kind of pressure gauge for this system that allows these fascinating tube feet to reach out and draw the organism around in the environment. And you can often see this on the surface of the starfish we see on the shores and in the seas of the eastern shores. So it's a really nice feature to look out for when if you come across these species on your surveys. So echinoderms have a really characteristic reproduction. So similar to most organisms, the males and females are separate, and they release different gametes. So the female's eggs and the male's sperm, and this is a sea urchin releasing gametes into the water, and this process leads to the formation of larvae which have bilateral symmetry. So if you remember, the adult forms, which is mostly what we'd be looking at when we're surveying, are radial in their symmetry. So kind of like the Terry's chocolate orange model of segments being copied around a central point. These larvae all have a bilateral symmetry, similar to our own body forms, with an eye on the left and an eye on the right, an arm on the left and arm on the right. So these larvae tell us that they explain the link between this radial Terry's chocolate orange design and the evolutionary pattern I spoke about, where there's a link between these guys and the vertebrates. The bilateral larvae go through a metamorphosis throughout their life. So here I'm just focusing in on a starfish larvae. And as it gets older, it develops appendages which allow it to move with more control in the water column, because these are free-living planktonic larvae. So the eggs and sperm are released into the water, and then the fertilization happens and these larvae are produced. And starfish are a particularly good example because they, in order to become adult, the larvae creates an anchor point, which it, while it's undergoing the final stages of its metamorphosis, it anchors itself down and completely changes its body form with its gut and mouth completely forming new mouths and new anuses on different sides of the organism, going from this bilateral top to bottom design to the Terry's chocolate orange of Starfish Wonderment, which has a radial symmetry based around the 5 arms that we might recognize. So this metamorphosis is really cool and happens for all of these species. They anchor to the ground and then change from this strange floating planktonic form into the adult that we might recognize with the radial symmetry. So these are the 5 main groups I'm going to talk about. And from here on in, I'm just going to review some of the biodiversity we can see in our eastern seas. And I'll use common names alongside Latin names, so as to demystify the biodiversity, but also I think Dawn will swoop down from on high if you don't memorize the Latin names, so try and stick to those. So the first class, and possibly the most ancient and basal class, are the Echinoderms. And these are the sea lilies and featherstars. And they're one of the most basic forms of echinoderms we see in the oceans. They have this beautiful body form, which is based on filter feeding. So they have a very high surface area, which is connected to a very basic central design. So they have a number of arms, which are arrayed around a central calyx. And this is attached to a holdfast with toes called cirri, which can be expressed to a greater or lesser degree. So it can be longer or shorter with more or less toes in different species. These species at one point were incredibly populous in the oceans. They were, we know from the fossil records, one of the most numerous organisms in the ocean at one point in our history. And this filter feeding design is is really ideal for staying in one place and pulling nutrients out of the water. So when there was much more water and less land, these species really thrived. They're sessile for the majority of their life history. It has been recorded, so I think this video might be a bit stilted over Zoom, so I apologize if this is a bit clunky for you, but I couldn't help but put it in because I think the idea of this beautiful feather-like filter feeder using its feathers to swim through the ocean is incredibly amazing. I don't know if it's something we could see in our UK waters, but I hope to see it one day. Because yeah, some species can move around. We don't know exactly why, whether it's to move to better filtering grounds or to escape predators, but it is quite commonly seen in some seas. Sadly, in eastern waters, the time we're most likely to see echinoids like this are as fossils, because it's one of the things that quite often pop out of the chalk. And if you see small pattern segments on the beaches of Norfolk, you're likely to have found a crinoid from the mid to late Paleozoic era, I think. So yeah, it's another way of interacting with these cool echinoderms that you might be able to do on our shores. The species we can see, however, and I've taken the recording information directly from NBN Atlas. So this is Seasearch recording data we're looking at, is this beautiful species, Echinoderm bifida, the common featherstar. Unfortunately, it's not present here in our eastern waters, much more westerly distributed and up in the lochs of Scotland. And this is a species which is about 5 centimeters long in the arm, and it can be confused with several other species, but Echinoderm is a species that, as far as the guide tells me, I've never dived up in Scotland yet. So apparently the mottling that we can see on the feathers is quite characteristic. There are several other Echinoderm species in those lochs, or in the range of these, but that's something to look for. We have other species, some that are a lot less common. So this is Leptometro celtica, the northern featherstar. And these are recognized by these really long toes to the cirri. They're often really bright white. And apparently these are found at much greater depths than the Antedon I showed you in the previous slide. There are lots of other species I haven't included, but I'm going to try and not go on too much. So yeah, this is only a taster of the echinoderms we can see. Possibly the most characteristic echinoderm that you may be aware of are the Asteroidea. These are the starfish, and they're one of the most evocative organisms of the ocean that people recognize in the general public. They have a huge variation in their form and function, but for the majority of species, they have this 5-pointed radial symmetry. I've spoken about the water vascular system that they use to move around, but another thing that is really well expressed in the starfish is this system echinoderms use to breathe. This is called the system of Papules, and these are outbranchings of the respiratory tissue, which branch out through between these calcium carbonate plates that make up the skin and allow gaseous exchange with the seawater as the organism moved around. So if we look really closely at the skin, we can see these lumpy surfaces. This is increasing the surface area for gaseous exchange of these species. I've already spoken about the tube feet and how they're used to move around, but these grooves that starfish have the tube feet arrayed in are called the ambulateral grooves. They give their name to the whole clade of these echinoderms. And they also could be used to move food towards a central mouth, which we can see here. And the mouth is really important because starfish, for the majority, in the majority of cases, are predatory species. So they will hunt down, move around in the environment and hunt down other organisms to eat. The mouth is at the center, and this is important because it is directly connected to the gut. So the anus is at the top of the organism. So the mouth is moved over the food source and food extracted from that. And starfish have an arrayment of digestive glands in their arms, which they use to create digestive enzymes, secrete those into the stomach. And often during feeding, the stomach is actually everted from the organism and used to dissolve the prey item they're focused on. So hopefully this video plays without too much stiltiness. It's quite a Lovecraftian fate that this bivalve meets. And we can see here in the middle, this white tissue being pushed out is actually the stomach of the starfish. So it's moving its body to where the food source is. And in this case, the bivalve doesn't have much chance. But if this was, say, a limpet stuck on a hard surface, the starfish would also be exerting a huge amount of pulling force on that shell to get the stomach underneath the shell and start to digest the flesh of the prey item while it's still alive. So this is quite a horrible fate for our poor bivalve, but a very effective way of predation in the oceans. So having introduced these horrible Asteroidea, I will talk about the ones we can see. So possibly one of our most commonly seen and most publicly popular echinoderm organisms, the common starfish, is seen all around the coast of the UK. I think there's about 30,000 records on NBN. So this is Asterias Rubens, and it's found all throughout the intertidal zone, but also down to diveable depths as well. So the smaller individuals are found in the nursery areas on the shore, so they will develop in the rocky shore. But there are individuals that get up to sizes of tens of centimeters across in deeper waters, and they will be actively predating and also scavenging on the seafloor. We also have another 5-armed species. This is Bloody Henry, one of my most favorite of organism names in the whole of nature. These actually represent a group of species. So the two common ones are Henricia oculata and Henricia sanguinolenta. These differ in their range, but they're actually very difficult to identify in the field. The Seasearch guide recommends always recording them as Henricia species. I'm not sure how Rob and Dawn handle records of those, but I'll leave that to them to point out later. There are also a range of species that we don't have the pleasure of hosting on our eastern shore. So the top two, Astropacten irregularis and Luidia ciliaris, the Sunstar and the 7-armed starfish, are species which do very well on very sandy, silty substrates. The spiny starfish is a species which can get very large. Individuals can get up to 35 centimeters across. And this is also a westerly distributed species that seems to do quite well in sheltered inlets and sea locks, where it can get to its largest sizes. And me and Emily found one of these in Cornwall 2 years ago, which was in rock pools, and we watched it move between rock pools and hunt limpets on the walls of the rock pools. Not the most graceful gazelle-like prey, but limpets also do this cool behavior where they rear up and try and pinch the tube feet of the starfish with their shell. And we'd seen this in a documentary, and then we watched it live with a spiny starfish as a star of that show. So I will always remember these with great pleasure, but not something we see in Norfolk, unfortunately. We also have cushion stars in the UK. These are 3 of the more common species, but there are a range of other species I haven't depicted. So the red cushion star, Perennia pulvilis, is about 12 centimeters across and quite a vibrant color. But one we're much more likely to see in other parts of the country in sort of more southerly locations on the west coast is the common cushion star, Asterina gibbosa. It's about up to 5 centimeters. And a species which isn't graced with a common name, but is incredibly beautiful is the sister species to Asterina gibbosa, Asterina phylactica, which has a really beautiful pattern on its top surface. It's only about 1.5 centimeters across, but a really nice one to look out for. We also have species with way more legs than 5. So these are the Sunstars, and there are 2 main species we'll see. They're not really confusable with anything else. One is much more northerly, so Solasta endeca is the purple sunstar, and that has 9 to 10 legs and is very distinguishable by its color. The Seasearch guide says it's quite chubby in appearance, so I'm sorry, Solasta endeca, you get body shamed by Seasearch. But the other is the common sea star, Solasta paposus, and this is a 10 to 14 armed species which has quite a lot of variation in its coloration. So the patterning of banding can be quite strong or quite weak. We were lucky enough to find one of these last year right on the shore at Hunstanton, but they're more commonly seen at diveable depths, I think. Yeah, so the skinny, lightweight brethren of the Asteroidea, the starfish, are the brittle and basket stars. So these have a much more reduced body form. They don't have the distributed organs like starfish, and all of their body organs are in this central capsule. So everything contained within here. They have a much less developed way of feeding. They just use these teeth, these outgrowths of the mouth to grind food, and they're much more scavenging than predation, like the starfish. And they also have much less need to respire in a complex way. So they don't have the outbranchings that I mentioned, the dermal branchiae. They use these bursal openings around the mouth to circulate oxygenated water and breathe. We see several common species all around the eastern coast. Sand brittle stars are Ophiuria species, and there are quite a few species that are similar. Two of the more common ones are Ophiuria and Ophiuria albida. And I think Mark from our group found a large wash-up of these in Lowestoft over this winter. So they're always something to keep an eye out for, even if you're not diving. You can recognize Ophiuria albida by these white triangles at the base of the legs. But this is a species not to record, to try and record to species level unless you can get a firm idea of the ID. We also have the common brittle star, a really beautiful species which we see all around the coast of the UK. These beautiful stripy legs with spines all over them. And yeah, it's so common. Even I've taken a photograph of it. We saw one up in one that was really nice to photograph in a rock pool in Northumberland. So yeah, lovely to see. Oh, I was going to say also that common brittle stars, they can be seen forming brittle star beds out at greater depth, so they can get up to huge numbers, and something I've never seen, but when diving, it's something really to keep an eye out for. Something that we do see quite often, and this is one for Elizabeth to look out for at West Runton, is the dwarf brittle star. So Amphipholus squamata. These are tiny little guys, only a few centimeters from tip of arm to tip of arm. And these are found all around the coast of the UK as well. But they're really nice species well, they're found at all depths, but they're easy to see in rock pools. And they're found in the kind of black sediments that are under big rocks where it gets really stinky. I think they kind of really like that delicious stinkiness. So yeah, one that can be really easily seen on eastern shores. There are many other species of brittle star that I'm not going to cover, but one that's a confusion species for the common brittle star is Ophiuchomina nigra, the black brittle star, which isn't actually that black. It can range all the way from really dark pigmentation up to kind of orangey color. So one to think about if you're trying to record the common brittle star. One of the final groups to talk about are the sea urchins. These are the Echinodea, and they represent sea urchins, sand dollars, and also heart urchins. They have this characteristic spherical shape, and their organs are specialized for a life history which is based on grazing. So we've looked at predators in the starfish, scavengers in the brittle stars, and now the grazers of the ocean are the sea urchins. They have this characteristic shape which you can think of as the arms of a starfish wrapped up around in this direction, and then spread out to form like an armored wall. So if you look on the internal surface of this cutaway diagram, you can see the kind of hexagon shaped plates. These are the ossicles, the calcium carbonate plates that strengthen the skin of echinoderms, but taken to an extreme. So they have a hard shell which supports these spines, which are a really defensive adaptation. And they also have this amazing adaptation to grazing, which is called Aristotle's lantern. It's a matrix of muscles and bones, which allows the sea urchin to graze with incredible force, because they peel the algae from the surface of everything on the ocean floor. So it's this organ, the Aristotle's lantern, that you can that they use to do that. And they can be incredibly destructive. They're one of the issues when marine ecosystems are knocked out of sync, and numbers of sea urchins get too high. The grazing of them can just strip all of the algae from an environment and completely knock the ecosystem into disarray, because the most basic part of it, the bit that produces nutrients into the environment, is just hoovered away by these incredibly efficient grazers. There are a number of species we see, but the common ones are the green sea urchin, Samachus miliaris, and these are found all around the coast of the UK. We've seen them up at Hunstanton and Holme on the north west tip of Norfolk, and they're often seen with this little like hat of detritus sitting on the top of them. It gets stuck into the spines, so I don't know if that's camouflaging or high fashion, but they're a beautiful green and purple colour, and kind of donut shaped. They're a bit flattened, which makes them very different from our common sea urchin, which is also seen on eastern shores in slightly less density by the looks of the Seasearch records. But this is a very spherical urchin, and one that's not really confusable with anything else, because it has this really characteristic spherical form, and also these short compact spines, which we don't see in any other species that we find in the UK. The last Echinoderm class to cover are the Holothurians. These are the sea cucumbers, and they're possibly the most bizarre extremity of Echinoderm evolution, and their biodiversity is very different to everything I've spoken about before, but it has the same features, although in a very different body form. So they have a secondary bilateral symmetry. So if you remember, bilateral symmetry is as our body form is, so a line down the middle with one copy of each thing on either side. And sea cucumbers have evolved this after, from an ancestor that had the radial symmetry we see in the others. So that's why they're so different. If we look at a cutaway, we can see that they have a head end, in inverted commas, and this is arrayed with modified tube feet. So the tube feet that we saw in the other species have gone back to a filter feeding pattern, and that they're arrayed around the mouth. But they still have some tube feet for moving around, and these are on the bottom of the organism. I really like this stop motion that was taken in a BBC documentary a couple of years ago, and it shows how often the modified tube feet that are used for feeding are inserted into the mouth to really get all of the particles off. So I thought this was a really cool shot, and I love including it to demonstrate how they feed. We've got a number of Holothurians in the UK waters. Unfortunately, none of them grace our eastern waters, and many of them are very hard to distinguish, so I haven't included the majority of species in this talk. A species that is quite commonly seen is the cotton spinner, Holothuria forscali, and this individual is showing one of the cool traits that sea cucumbers exhibit, which is the expression of cuvarian tubes. So they have this behavior that when they're threatened, they will shoot out this huge mass of tubes, which are thought to only have defensive properties. They're not for anything else. And these often have some sort of toxin covering them, but they often scare away predators to the sea cucumber. And that's where the name cotton spinner comes from, this defensive adaptation. Some sea cucumber species can really, they completely shoot all of their organs out of their mouth. And this is quite an extreme extent of defending yourself, but they are able to regenerate a lot of their internal organs. So they take this way of sort of vomiting themselves to safety quite seriously. two other species that are worth mentioning are some of the crevice living sea cucumber species. So these are two that both express dark gill structures and protrude from crevices like this. And they're distinguishable by the flesh of their main body. So we can see Aslia lefevre or lefevre is very dark on the body, whereas Porsonia saxicola, the romantically named sea gherkin, is white on its body. So yeah, people diving on the western shores, keep an eye out for crevice brittle stars. So I'll bring the talk to a close there. A small peek at the evolutionary history of these guys. They're ancient divergence from other invertebrates, but closer similarity to the vertebrates that we are. 5 major groups: Crinoidea, Asteroidea, Ophiuroidea, Echinodea, and Holothurians. And about 25 common species that you can see in UK and Irish waters, but many more to find if you get really into them. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Well, awesome, Will. Thank you very much. I feel a whole lot more accomplished and sophisticated for listening to that than I did before. So thank you ever so much. We've got a couple of politely and formally asked questions while it was going along. I think the first was from Inga, and she asked, how long does the planktonic stage last? So that dates back to one of your early slides.
I'm afraid I don't know, Inga. I think, so usually these things happen on a yearly cycle, like in other species that I know about the plankton of, but I can't firmly say I know of any actual timescale for echinoderms.
No worries. I guess that's their most vulnerable stage, when they're open to being predated on by fish and anything else in the plankton sort of thing. So I guess a lot of them get picked off at that stage of their life cycle.
I would imagine you're totally correct. I think these things are done, I think they broadcast spawn. So millions of eggs and millions of sperm are released. And I'd imagine that leads to millions of these tiny larvae. And it's where natural selection can really take place, because the fish can zoom through these clouds of plankton seemingly endlessly, and we still have our huge populations of these creatures. So yeah, I think they're definitely at risk, but I think they play the numbers game in this instance.
Do they time their spawning with the lunar cycle like corals do?
Again, yeah, I'm not really sure, but I think those sorts of things can be really important for the tides, I guess. So I think it's highly likely. But yeah, I'd be really interested to well, I'm inspired to find out more about them from putting these slides together. So
cool.
Yeah, it's something to look into.
Yeah. Excellent. I think I've heard a suggestion that they are sort of cyclic and, like you say, tide dependent, because that's the most effective time. I think if you're a sort of a small dim animal, sort of like a Boris Johnson kind of thing, then the idea of just spawning is appealing because it's effective. And I've seen starfish and urchins sort of spawning, and I think it's not quite like sort of midnight on the darkest or the brightest moonlight. It just seems to be during a period of strong tides, they give it a good old go, and they just sit steaming on the bottom. Aha. We have a second question. Or the second question is from Elizabeth, and she says, no Crinoidea or Holothurians in East Anglian waters?
Because I'm being
sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
I'm sorry. I think I'll calm Inga down. Elizabeth asks, and it may even be easier for you to have a look at the chat. So, did you say there were no crinoids or sea cucumbers in East Anglian waters?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So
I think that's kind of unfair on Will as a non-diver. We don't see them is the short answer. It's odd that the crinoids don't get down here, and it might be that it's a kind of break in habitat thing, that they just don't find it easy to get down here, or we don't offer them sort of a hard substrate and relatively calm water, because the chalk, although you might think, oh, they'd love that. I've seen them on things similar shaped to chalk gully tops, but we have a long run in, and perhaps they could occur deeper in other places, and they're just not strong enough to hold on around the chalk. They are great looking things, and as Will said, I mean, the books will go on about sort of counting the number of joints in toes, but for the most part, it's lengths of toes that set things apart, and numbers of toes. So it's all about the toes, and because all of the three crinoids we see, the Celtic, the relatively common one, and it's Patussus, I don't know its common name, they're all about the same size, they're all quite bright, and in groups, they're kind of difficult to tell apart. The Celtic ones do tend to be that colour that you're showing, but they all sort of muck in together, and sometimes it's difficult to find their feet, but it's all about the feet.
Thank you very much, Rob. Can I just say, Will, that was amazing. Thank you. I have made pages of notes. I've got hand cramp now. That was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's really, really kind of you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I did have some questions of my own.
Sure.
The first was, Will, shouldn't an evolutionary biologist have more arms?
If only that was the case. I would be producing code at a speed unrivaled by anyone else. But yeah, I will work on it.
Excellent. Because like Elizabeth, I just feel enriched for seeing this. I mean, like Elizabeth's diatom pictures, and people are doing some great stuff. And I'll ask a question which other people will ask. Is it okay to put this on YouTube, or would you rather this wasn't shared?
No, it's totally fine. Yeah, by all means.
That's brilliant. Okay, that's brilliant. My first real question is, you mentioned that the radial canals were at a different osmotic pressure.
Yes.
Is it like they're sort of filled with a hydraulic fluid that allows the feet to work better?
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, I'll go back to this slide. This organ, the madreporite, is a really, really complex, quite, it's like calcified organ, which maintains a really fine balance of hydraulic pressure, basically, to allow you can see on the urchin picture there how far these arms can reach, and they can also respond to prey items or threats. So they're really they can really carefully control this hydraulic pressure, and I think the complex structure of that organ allows this to be balanced to, I guess, also the environmental changes in the seawater, sort of at different changing depths and stuff. But yeah, I don't fully understand the system, but I think it's very cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it looks, for the most part, it looks like the tube legs are kind of like mass operated. They're a bit like sort of a centipede leg, that there's a thematic movement to them, which can be maybe directed down a leg. So one of the most amusing things you can see is a brittle star change direction, because it's kind of looks anthropomorphic. It looks like it's heading in a direction and one of its feet is ahead and the others row it along. And then if you give it a bit of a scare, it'll head off in a different direction, seemingly nominating another head, but doing the same kind of stuff. But things like, the big spiny starfish and quite a lot of the urchins have specialist tube arms with tools on the end. So they can actually, they have sort of pincers, sort of 2 and 3 pointed pincers. And those look like they must need something more complicated. That those arms don't all sort of seem to work together. They seem pretty weirdly independent.
Yeah, I mean, it would be amazing to understand more about how that coordination works. I know they have relatively developed nervous systems in comparison to other invertebrates in the ocean, but yeah, I don't know anything about how that's centralized and how they might be controlled. But yeah, I didn't go into the kind of diversity of appendages on starfish.
No.
I think I there's a picture of the spiny starfish. Yeah, this down here you can see the variation of appendages that cover the outer surface. But yeah, there's a whole range of self-cleaning mechanisms as well on the carapace. They can remove algae by the appendages of the skin. So there's a whole different way of dealing with environmental, I guess dirt. But yeah, really, really cool system.
Excellent. Yeah, I'd recommend spiny starfish. If you're on a terrible dive or the visibility is really poor, you can get as close as you like to a spiny starfish and just look at the detail on them, because there's all kinds of stuff going on. They're quite a big showy starfish, but they reward looking even closer. I was going to comment, you talked about depths, and you're right that some of these things have a tendency to turn up deeper or more shallow. And we tend to think of the common sunstars as occurring perhaps beyond 7-8 meters. So they're tough for snorkelers to see, not least because that puts them about 300-400 meters offshore. But everything comes in and can't avoid coming in when there's heavy tides. So yeah, it's unusual to see, but yeah, it's a chance.
It was probably on the end of its 8 or 14 legs.
Yeah. Well, I think these things don't. I think when they're walking around, they make quite good progress, but they don't always. They can't fight a strong current. And I was minded when you talked about. When I talk to nice old ladies in WIs about starfish and things, I say, well, the difference between, say, a starfish and an urchin is if you imagine hitting a starfish on the head and it went, ow, and put all its arms up to protect itself, then that's kind of like an urchin. And occasionally you see this behavior in starfish where they're in high current and they'll bawl like that, and just it allows them to roll with the tide.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so I don't know whether that's just them going, ouch, I have hurt my head, or this is giving me a real headache, but it seems to allow them to drift along with the prevailing tide and make much better progress than they would otherwise. Somewhere I have terrible footage of that happening.
It's very cool. I'd like to see that.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think the prevailing comment is probably that we don't see many of these in the East, and it's not really obvious why. I think perhaps some are a bit delicate. Maybe some of them find the temperature ranges a bit much, because the West Coast is that whole bit more stable because it has the Atlantic as a kind of stabilizing influence, which is just huge. Whereas the North Sea is just like a sort of a water butt in the garden. It can chill, it just doesn't get a lot of sort of exchange through it. So whereas stuff on the West Coast maybe probably doesn't even quite have a 10-degree range, the stuff over on the East, particularly the shallow stuff, can have near a 20-degree range. And so I think it's pretty hostile for animals that can't manage their own temperature. Perhaps.
I think that's a very fair point.
Yeah.
Coming off of Cly is a great place to see the common sunstar. We always see loads when we're diving out of Cly towards the Vera and out towards the forest.
Yeah, I think they like the boulder plain there, don't they? They like the barnacles on it. And yeah, out by the forest, there's an area called William's Flints, which was accidentally discovered when William missed the Vera completely. And that's an area of deeper boulders at about 8-9 meters. and that's generally got a lot of the.
We know exactly what you mean. We've missed the Vera as well.
We've missed the Vera too.
Yeah, it's a sign you've missed the Vera when you've gone to double its depth and you start finding sunstars. You know you've overshot it by about 200 meters, but it's an interesting spot. I mean, I guess, Will, it might be interesting for. We could talk to the snorkelers and see how deep they're happy to go, and try to get you to some spots which have stuff you don't normally see, but wouldn't want to try and find just as a lottery sort of entry. But if we went out there with a buoy, you could probably join us and duck down and have a look.
Oh yeah, I'm a diver. Don't worry, I'll be down there with you.
Oh, excellent, excellent.
Yeah, we've not done that much sea diving. Like not quite on our 10 UK sea dives, but we're on about 6. So we're just kind of scared of coming diving with you, very experienced people.
No, honestly, I mean, the danger with people who aren't experienced is overplaying their experience. As my first sea trip, or my first big weekend away, I went up to the Farns with a group of people I'd never met before, and stupidly we'd bought some second-hand Poseidon regulators, which, I mean, to the initiated, make it look like you're a hardcore diver. And one of the guys in the club said, "Oh, they'll know you're serious with those on." And I thought, well, no, I will be absolutely honest that I'm not. I do not want them to mistake me for an experienced diver on what would have been my 3rd sea dive. And just as well I didn't, because I think my first dive, the dump of my jacket just got caught under a strap. And so I just found that I was trying to ascend really fast and be cool alongside the experienced diver. And it was easy because my jacket wouldn't hold any air. So I just went straight to the bottom at 28 meters, convinced him that I was, in fact, pretty cool and experienced because I'd done this rapid ascent. And then was glad he didn't just sod off, but he stayed while I sorted that out. And I had a great time. But if you want to dive, then whereas within Seasearch, then there are strict limits. If you are just encountering someone like me and you say, I'd like to gain more experience, then quite a few of us are of a suitable grade that we can accompany littler divers. And honestly, this is not big, scary diving. This is really nice experience gathering British diving. So you get things like a really hard swim, surging current, tides that pick up, but all at depths that you can ascend from pretty quickly. So it's a great place. Are you dry suited yet?
Not quite yet, but double wetsuited, so
okay.
we're ready.
Well, that's brilliant fun if you're in a dry suit, because the shallowness makes it very challenging to keep yourself neutral. So it's brilliant practice for that as well.
We have done a dry suit dive. We're dry suit qualified.
Yeah, dry suit qualified.
The
but
first,
not owning.
The first dive we did at the Rosalie was dry suit, but then we preferred the wetsuits only.
Yeah, we do through the summer as well. It's just I think an unnecessary complication when the water's warm enough. But having one's good, because all those Scottish echinoderms, I do have friends who dive Scotland in wetsuits, and they tend to do one really intense dive a day. And I admire them for it and have absolutely no interest in doing the same pattern of diving. It's quite nice to be warm up there. Well worth it. We've got another question in. Oh, and that's if I head off Elizabeth, who's just asked a snorkeling question, I'll say there are some other weird echinoderms as well, some very worm-like echinoderms, which we've seen in Scotland. And I mean, those have mystified us. So the echinoderms are a big, weird group. And this kind of, the symmetry thing is generally an anchor. But some of the things we've seen have looked like a hoover attachment, a very small hoover attachment with a flower on the end. And you just think, oh, this is some kind of sort of an alien genital that is poking out of the sand. This is very strange, and it took a while to find it because it was right at the back of Bernard Picton's Echinoderm book. Worth looking. Elizabeth asks, is there anywhere or anyone who can help me get more experience in snorkeling? My experience is 0. Then I'd say lots of people can get you more experience than 0. Be careful of them. What we're aiming to do, I was talking with Chris Taylor, who's done some of those nice, glamorous looking snorkeling videos, but then did a challenging and in detail tricky how to snorkel video. And I said it would be nice, and this is my first chance to ask Will and Emily and any other snorkelers, what I would try to do is have a talk for the snorkeling group about different people's approaches, what they like and don't like, rather than dwelling on absolute, encourage lots of people to recommend and dictate something. We'll talk about the basic safety and then talk about what people who enjoy snorkeling have actually used and what they like. And hopefully we'll pump that out via the usual channels. But it was a particular request. And I think on the whole, snorkeling is something you can approach on your own, but there are fantastic shortcuts that are not apparent to anybody. Like the duck diving bit. If you can't duck dive, snorkeling is massively hard work and mystifying. I took some lovely people from the fisheries and Natural England out. None of them could duck dive. None of them could understand why they couldn't just swim to the bottom. So there's some key techniques. There's how to put the kit on, but on the whole, the basic requirement is a strong and confident swimmer, and then you are away with a few pointers.
There's a whole load of stuff about things like weights and suits and such like that you get taught when you do diving that nobody ever tells you about when it comes to snorkeling, and you kind of have to work it out yourself to some extent. And I think that there's things around that actually be really useful to share some experience. If you actually were able to hear me at all.
Yes.
Yes.
Came through loud and clear. I think that's a good point, because I think on the whole, oh, the cat's being friendly for once. On the whole, yeah, the nuances aren't explained to snorkelers. Most snorkeling you are thrown in, and you can find that you are a good or bad snorkeler depending on what suit you've been put in. Because you might find somebody said, oh, just bring along any old wetsuit. I mean, nice thick wetsuit. It will be next to impossible for you to snorkel because you'll be so buoyant. Terrible old wetsuit. Oh, you're naturally talented. Excellent. Because the thing is like paper and doesn't make you float. And that's where the weighting comes in, which I think is probably a bit of a development. You want to be confident at snorkeling before you weight yourself up, because although it'll make it easier to dive, there's this nice changeover point where it makes it easier to stay forever. And you don't want that. You want that to be something you approach, yeah, with full and comfortable knowledge, rather than it being a lovely surprise.
Indeed.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I've got one. So when I was a kid, there were two things that everybody knew about starfish. One was they sting, so never touch one, and the other one was about them being able to regenerate from all manner of chopped up bits of body part. What's the truth on all this?
As far as I know, I don't think they sting, but they do have quite a bite, and they can secrete acids. So maybe there's some sort of element of that in what might be perceived as a sting. And they do have the tiny pincers that Rob was talking about on some of their arms, so there might be nipping involved. But in terms of like a wasp venom sting, I don't think they do have. Rob?
I was going to say, as far as I know, hardly any do at all, but I know that crown of thorns starfish do have a toxin, and they can cause long-lasting and really uncomfortable sort of thing, necrosis. Yeah, so if you see a crown of thorns starfish off Weybourne, avoid it.
But record it.
Yeah, it's a tourist, yes.
Yes.
Sorry, and on to regeneration, Will.
Which I think my main reference is Rob, perhaps.
Okay.
That they can be. I think one of the wives' tales is that the crab fishermen would see them as detrimental to if they found them in pots, and would chop them in half with an axe and throw them back into the waters, and they would then just regenerate from large fragments. So if you see a starfish with a smaller arm, it might be an arm that's regenerating, I think.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that people just don't hang around with starfish enough. It reminds me of the hats. Must mention the hats, because the hats are cool. I think they do regenerate, and often in a fight or a scuffle, because basically crabs will have a go at anything. So you do see injured starfish, and they can regenerate a leg. And I think the urban version of the tale is that they can regenerate from sort of part of an intact disc. Like the leg won't regenerate, but if there's a bit of disc left, then the rest can regenerate, which prompts the question, what if you cut it in half? And I've seen one big leg regenerating pretty much the rest of a starfish. So I would imagine that actually they can regenerate from a fragment of a core. So it's very likely that they can multiply regenerate. Almost reproduction by fission, only in forced fission.
Yeah, I've heard, sorry, Rob. I was just going to say, I've heard the same, that as long as there's a piece of the disc still, living, that it can regenerate from that. I've got lots of pictures of common starfish in various stages of regeneration, and sadly all deceased because they've been washed up. But I'm happy to post those on Facebook if people are interested in seeing some starfish with odd-sized legs and odd numbers of legs.
Excellent. Yeah, that would be fun. One of the most fun things about starfish is the strange anthropomorphic poses they strike. I love seeing a starfish apparently hiding around a corner, because they stick to walls and they always look like they're hiding around a corner. But the urchin behavior, that the hat wearing, is a thing that so people who've done studies on urchins find they get stressed if they don't have material they can wear, which means that in urchin labs, they'll give them pieces of seaweed. But you can also see online that there are people who've 3D printed little hats, and starfish will put them on and will wear them because they do like a bit of cover. And that seems to be, it's functional for them because they like a bit of, who knows what they think they look like. But in the wash, where we don't see many urchins along the top of North Norfolk, but when we've dived in the wash, we've seen the common shore green urchins, the Samichinus miliaris. They gather all kinds of detritus to them. And where we've seen little gatherings of animals, perhaps sort of a spider crab, a prawn hanging around, a bit of hydroid, we find that actually usually at the core, there's a shore urchin. And it's picked up stones, which it's studied all over itself. So it looks like a bit like a grenade. It's got little, just some square chunks of stone all over. And they've become moving, mobile mini reefs. So although the bottom of the wash doesn't have a whole lot of sort of hard substrate, the urchins are doing that. And so you have these little tiny colonies with a whole lot of animals all trying to balance on top of an urchin. And initially you think, oh, that's interesting. So periodically these little boulders or cobbles are allowing communities to form, and all of them had an urchin in. So it's all about urchin comfort.
That's very cool.
Oh, good fun. Oh, yeah. I think on the whole, I think that's run through the things I would have said, and we'll have to get you in diving so you can see more of these things.
Oh yeah,
we are not rich in echinoderms that are visible. Our feeling is perhaps that, I mean, we miss a lot of brittle stars because they're really not very showy. I think they're hanging around much more often than we think. We get the common stuff, and you're right, the bloody henrys, the flush of ones of a specific species around the coast were when we thought we knew what we were doing. And tragically, with the advances in sort of DNA typing, people are losing confidence effectively in recording, because they're realizing, well, when we used to be happy that that one was a particular thing, now it's a mix and you can't be confident anymore. But where we're probably completely missing out is these burrowing and crevice cucumbers and brittle stars, where there's probably quite a lot more of them in the field, but for some reason we don't go and dig stuff up. And so plenty of them are hiding out the way. And some of the burrowing cucumbers, which we see in Scotland, are very seasonal. So we'll go to a site and there will be none. And I think, oh, that's a shame. Hope to see some burrowing cucumbers here. And you go at the right time of year and the bottom is like a flower bed with these things sticking out. And we don't do full season coverage up here, because the water clears around July and we dive until it stops in around November. So there's probably plenty of things that we just don't see. Now, Inga says, look out for the outline of a brittle star when crossing the sand to the Rosalie. That's good open stuff. I think that the life there isn't very dense, is it? So you look the wrong way, you miss it. And things like masked crabs, I mean, when they break cover, they're completely obvious. And when they don't break cover, they're easy to miss.
Also, I know that some of you guys know that I have a few of the dwarf brittle stars at the rock pools, but I've also found them hiding in whelk egg cases as well. So the ones that roll up on the beach, if you kind of look gently in between some of the eggs, you can find not only porcelain crabs, but also some sort of juvenile brittle stars as well.
Excellent. Oh, my cat has just punched you in the face, Elizabeth. I'm very sorry.
I feel honoured, Rob.
Yeah.
I can be. I don't mind.
Yeah, he's quite good-natured. I'd put Will on the big television so I could see his slides better, and that the cat found you fascinating. Excellent. Well, that was super. I think proper aspirational stuff. Really nice presentations. Knocks the Seasearch Echinoderms bit into a cocked hat. So thank you ever so much for doing that.
It's an absolute pleasure. Like, really great to be able to talk to you guys about this stuff as well.
Cool.
And great discussion afterwards. It's really enjoyable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. If you're all happy, and who could not be happy after a fun chat like that, I'll let you go. And I think we should all shout or grunt our appreciation. I don't think I can unmute everybody simultaneously. You'll have to do it yourself. So thank you very much. Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. And I suppose we might ask Elizabeth to do diatoms.